I heard it with my own ears. Standing on the porch of the house that was once mine, they thought I hadn't arrived yet. Through the open window, my daughter-in-law Brenda's voice, quiet and clear, cut through the evening quiet. Why is she still alive? Her death would solve all our financial problems. And my son, my Mark, didn't argue. He just let out a weary sigh. Such a deep, tired breath, as if he'd just unloaded a train car of coal, not simply agreed that his own mother was a burden. But you know the worst part? I didn't leave right away. I froze. I just stood there, petrified on the third step, holding that damned cherry pie. It was still warm. I'd driven 3 hours with it, a towel covering it to keep the heat in, and I stood there, my feet feeling like they'd grown roots into the porch wood. I couldn't move, and I kept listening. It was like watching a car crash in slow motion. You don't want to see it, but you can't look away. We could finally redo her room. Brenda continued in that same businesslike tone. It's like a museum in there. All those doilies, the photographs. We could turn it into a home office for you, honey. And he, my son, he answered. He didn't just sigh. He answered, yeah, that would be good. I need more space for work. They were talking about me as if I were already just a collection of things, a set of furniture that needed to be disposed of. Then Brenda mentioned my jewelry. I don't have much, but my mother's wedding ring, the earrings my father gave me. She said they wouldn't suit Lily, my granddaughter. Too old-fashioned, better to sell them. That would cover part of the credit card debt, she said. Every word she spoke was a nail. And his silence, his quiet yas, uh-huhs, and we'll think about it's. That was the hammer, driving those nails into the lid of my coffin. They were planning their life, their bright, spacious future, and my grave was meant to be its foundation. I listened for 5 minutes, maybe 10. It felt like an eternity. The air smelled of pine from the lake and freshly cut grass. Crickets were chirping somewhere. Such a peaceful evening. And there I was, listening to my own sentence. And then, something inside me just snapped. Slowly, very slowly, I bent down and placed the pie on the top step, carefully, so I wouldn't break the dish. I remember how my fingers felt against the cold wood. I straightened the towel over it. Then, just as silently, I turned around, walked down the steps, got into my old car, and drove away. The door closed softly, without a slam. I didn't want to disturb them. They never tasted it. I found out later from Lily. She found it the next morning, cold by then, ants starting to gather at the sweet smell. She asked them, "Did Grandma come by?" And they lied. They said I must have gotten my days mixed up. The drive home was long. 3 hours in complete silence. I didn't turn on the radio. I just stared at the white line spooling out under my wheels, and I didn't cry. There were no tears. There was just a strange, icy emptiness inside me. I looked at my hands on the steering wheel, these old, liver-spotted hands, and I remembered. I remembered the day, 10 years ago, when we sat in our family lawyer's office, Mr. Harrison's office. I was signing the deed to that house, my house, the one my husband and I had built, putting every penny we had into it. I was giving it to them for their 10th wedding anniversary. Mr. Harrison had asked so gently, "Eleanor, are you sure? Perhaps you should retain a life estate?" And I just laughed. I said, "It's Mark, my son. It's my family. I want them to have a fortress, not just a house." A fortress. What a fool I was. I was building them a fortress, and behind my back, they were digging me a grave. When I got back to my little apartment in the city, For the first time in hours, I felt my hands begin to shake. I poured myself a cup of tea but couldn't bring myself to drink it. It just sat there, growing cold, like that pie on their porch. I sat in my old kitchen until morning, and the pain, that first searing pain, began to change into something else, into a cold, hard resolve. They had talked about my things, my money, my life, as if it were an inconvenience, a problem that my death would solve. I looked out the window at the gray dawn and thought, I've spent my life building them a home. Now, it's time to secure my own foundation. And I knew my first step would be a phone call, a call to Mr. Harrison. That first night, after I got home, was the longest of my life. I didn't sleep. I just sat at this table, right where I am now, and watched the darkness outside my window turn into a flat, gray morning. The tea I made went cold. My back was stiff. But my mind was perfectly, horribly clear. The shock had burned away, and what was left was like cold, hard steel. By the time the sun came up, I knew what I had to do. It wasn't about revenge. I've never been a vengeful woman. It was about order. It was about cleaning a house that had become filled with something toxic. My life was that house, and I decided to clean it, room by room. I planned it out in my head, 3 simple steps. My first step was the most important. At 9 o'clock sharp, when I knew his office would be open, I picked up the phone. My hand wasn't shaking anymore. I dialed the number for Mr. Harrison, my lawyer. He's known me since before Mark was born. He handled my husband's will, a good, old-fashioned man who still uses paper and a fountain pen. His voice was exactly as I remembered it, calm, steady. Eleanor, how are you? I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I'm fine, Robert, I said, and my own voice sounded strange to me, distant. I need to come in. I need to make some changes to my will and to my power of attorney. There was a slight pause on his end. No surprise, no prying questions, just a quiet, "Of course. Would 10:30 this morning work for you?" When I walked into his office, with its smell of old books and leather, it felt like stepping into a different world, a world where things made sense. He sat me down, offered me coffee, and then just looked at me over the top of his spectacles. "What's on your mind, Eleanor?" I took a breath and laid it out. "I want to change my will. Everything. I want my entire estate, what little there is, to go to Lily, a trust to be managed by you until she's 25. He nodded slowly, making a note on a yellow legal pad. "And Mark?" "Mark is to be written out," I said. "He and his wife, Brenda, are to receive nothing. I want a clause in there, very specific, that states this is not an oversight, that it is my deliberate wish." Mr. Harrison didn't flinch. He just kept writing. "And the power of attorney?" "Revoked. Effective immediately," I said. "I'll handle my own affairs. If I become unable, I want the court to appoint someone, not my son." He finally put his pen down and looked at me. His eyes were kind, but sharp. He saw everything. "Eleanor, we should discuss the house. The gift deed is irrevocable. It would be a long, painful, and likely losing battle to try and get it back." And that's when I surprised him. "I don't want the house back," I said, and the words felt like truth in my mouth. That house is a memorial now, a monument to a life that's over. Let them keep it. Let them live inside their hollow victory. I'm not interested in the past, Robert. I'm interested in protecting my future, whatever is left of it. He understood. He drafted the new documents right then and there. An hour later, I sat at his large mahogany desk with a heavy black fountain pen in my hand. the same kind of pen I'd used 10 years ago to sign that house over to them. I remember how my hand had flown across the page then, full of love and hope. This time, my signature was slow, careful, deliberate. The scratch of the nib on the thick, creamy paper was the only sound in the room. With each letter of my name, I felt a cord snapping. A heavy, tangled cord that had been wrapped around my heart for years. When I was done, I felt lighter. I walked out of that law office, and the city air felt different. I could breathe all the way down to the bottom of my lungs. That was step 1. Step 2 was the bank. It was less emotional, more practical. For years, I'd kept a small joint savings account with Mark. It was an emergency fund I'd set up when he first went to college. It didn't have a lot of money in it, maybe $5,000, but it was a safety net. I think they'd forgotten all about it. But I knew that in their minds, it was just another one of Mom's assets that would one day be theirs, a little bonus. I walked into the bright, cold bank and went straight to a teller. A young woman who couldn't have been older than Lily. She barely looked at me. I slid my bank book and my identification under the glass. "I'd like to close this account, please," I said, "and I'll take the balance in a cashier's check." She typed, clicked, and printed. There was no emotion, just procedure. And it was perfect. This wasn't a family drama for her. It was a transaction. She pushed a form towards me. I signed it. She stamped it. And just like that, another string was cut. She handed me the check, and I folded it neatly and put it in my purse. Another small piece of my life that was now entirely my own. The third and final step I did when I got back home. I sat down at my kitchen table again. I picked up my phone. I scrolled through my contacts until I saw their names. Brenda, Mark. For a moment, I just stared at them. All those years of calls, of "I love you, Mom," of holiday plans and questions about recipes. It was all there, in those 2 little entries. I didn't hesitate. I tapped on Brenda's name, found the option, and pressed "Block this caller." A little confirmation screen popped up. I pressed "Block contact." She was gone. Then I did the same for Mark, my own son. Tap, scroll, block. The finality of it was so quiet, so simple. It didn't make a sound. But in the silence of my apartment, it felt like a heavy door slamming shut, a door I knew I would never, ever open again. When it was all done, I sat back. The lawyer, the bank, the phone, 3 steps. I hadn't cried. I hadn't screamed. I had just cleaned. I thought to myself, this isn't revenge. This is hygiene, life hygiene. You find something that is making you sick, and you remove it. You sanitize the wound. You create a clean, quiet space where you can begin to heal. And for the first time since I stood on that porch, listening through the window, I felt a sense of peace, a cold, empty, but peaceful feeling. The storm was over. Now, the silence could begin. The silence that followed those 3 steps was profound. It wasn't an empty silence. It was full. It was the kind of quiet you get after a violent thunderstorm has passed, when the air is clean and still, and you can hear your own heartbeat. For 2 days, there was nothing. No calls, no messages. I moved through my small apartment, making tea, reading a book, watering my plants. It felt like I was holding my breath, waiting. I knew they wouldn't have noticed yet. They were living in their fortress by the lake, planning the future they would build on my ashes. My absence was probably a relief to them. The first ripple came on the 3rd day. It was a Tuesday afternoon. My phone, which had been silent for so long, buzzed on the kitchen table. I looked down. It was a text from Mark. Just 5 words. "Hey, Mom, you okay?" I stared at it. So casual, so normal. The old me, the Eleanor of last week, would have called back immediately, bubbling with apologies for being quiet, asking about his day, about Lily, about the dog. But I just looked at his name on the screen, and I did nothing. I let the phone go dark. An hour later, it buzzed again. Another text from him. "Haven't heard from you. Call me." This one had a little edge to it, a hint of impatience. I imagined him frowning at his phone, annoyed that I wasn't responding on his schedule. I felt a small, cold satisfaction. I put the phone face down on the table. The calls started that evening. First Mark. I let it ring until it went to voicemail. I didn't listen to the message. 10 minutes later, Brenda called. Her name flashed on the screen, and I felt a jolt of something ugly in my gut. I rejected the call. I pressed the red button and watched her name disappear. It felt like a small act of power. This continued for another day, a frantic dance of missed calls and unread texts. Their tone began to shift. Mark's messages became pleading. "Mom, seriously, what's going on?" "We're worried." Brenda's were sharp, accusatory. "Eleanor, if you're trying to make a point, this is a very childish way to do it." Childish? She thought this was childish. She, who had calmly discussed the financial benefits of my death while I stood on her porch. The sheer audacity of it almost made me laugh. I think they finally understood on Thursday. That's when the real panic must have set in. I imagine Mark tried to use that joint account, maybe for something small, like buying groceries online, or maybe he was checking the balance, just to be sure his little safety net was still there, and he would have found it gone. An empty space where $5,000 used to be, a closed account, a dead end. That's when the siege began in earnest. The phone didn't just buzz, it screamed. It rang and rang and rang, a relentless, desperate sound in my quiet apartment. The texts became a flood of frantic, capitalized words. From Mark. "Mom, I got a notification from the bank. What did you do? Call me right now." From Brenda. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing, Eleanor, but it stops now. You have no right." And then back to Mark, his tone shifting again, trying to pull the old strings of guilt and love. "Mom, please. I'm scared. Did something happen? Are you sick? Just let me know you're alive. Why is she still alive?" The echo of Brenda's voice was so clear in my head. They were worried I was alive all right. Worried I was alive and in control of my own life. I turned the phone off completely. The silence that rushed back in was a blessing. I knew they wouldn't give up. They had tested the virtual walls. Now they would come for the physical ones. It was Saturday morning when the doorbell rang. It was a harsh, jarring sound that cut right through the peace I had so carefully constructed. I wasn't expecting anyone. My heart gave a painful thud against my ribs. I moved slowly from the kitchen, my slippers whispering on the floor, and went to the front door. I put my eye to the peephole, and there they were. The little circle of glass distorted them, made them look like strange, warped fish in a bowl. Mark was standing right in front, his face tight with anxiety. He looked tired. He kept running a hand through his hair. Behind him, slightly to the side, was Brenda. Her arms were crossed tightly over her chest, her mouth a thin, hard line. I could see her whispering to him, urging him on. They looked pathetic, like two children who had been caught and were now trying to figure out how to talk their way out of punishment. Mark rang the bell again, a long, insistent press. "Mom, I know you're in there. We saw your car." I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just watched. He knocked, a soft, hesitant rap at first. "Mom, please, just open the door. We need to talk." Silence. I could see Brenda's jaw clench. She nudged him hard. The knocking became louder, more demanding. It was a fist now, pounding on the solid wood of my door. "Eleanor!" It was Brenda's voice now, sharp and cold, cutting through the wood. "This is absurd. Open this door. We are your family." My family. The word hung in the air between us. A lie. My hand was on the doorknob, the cold brass a stark contrast to my warm skin. The old instinct was there, a deep, primal urge to open the door for my child, to soothe his distress, to make things right. It was a physical pull, a pain in my chest. For a moment, I almost gave in. But then I saw his face again through the peephole, the face of the man who had sighed his consent to my death, the man who had listened while his wife planned how to dispose of my belongings. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that opening that door would be the ultimate betrayal not of him, but of myself. It would mean that my pain didn't matter, that my life didn't matter. So I stood there, perfectly still, my forehead resting against the cool wood of the door, and I waited for the storm to pass. They stayed for almost half an hour. They pleaded, they threatened, they accused. Their voices rose and fell. I heard Mark's voice crack at one point. I heard Brenda curse under her breath. And through it all, I was the silent, unmovable object. On the other side, the peephole was my shield. I could see them, but they couldn't see me. I had the complete picture, and they were left outside, in the dark. Finally, they gave up. I heard Brenda say, "Forget it, Mark. She's lost her mind." I watched them turn, their shoulders slumped in defeat, and walk away down the hall. I stayed at the door until the sound of the elevator doors closing reached me. Only then did I move. I walked back to my kitchen table on legs that felt like jelly. The adrenaline left me, and a deep, soul-shaking weariness took its place. It hurt. It hurt more than I could have imagined, to see my son's face contorted like that, to be the cause of his pain, even if he had caused me so much more. But underneath the hurt was a bedrock of resolve. I had held the line. Later that evening, I turned my phone back on. It was flooded with notifications. I ignored them all, except for one. A single message from a number I hadn't blocked, from Lily. Her text was simple. "Grandma, I know everything. Dad told me you were being difficult. I heard them arguing. I found the pie that day. I'm so sorry." Tears pricked my eyes for the first time in a week. Her words were a little bridge of light in all that darkness. She was the one good, true thing left. I took a deep, shaky breath and typed a reply. It took me a long time to get the words right. Finally, I wrote, "I love you too, my dear. More than words can say. But right now, Grandma needs some time to heal." I sent it. It was a boundary, yes, but it wasn't a wall. It was a message that my love for her was separate from the mess with her parents. It was the only olive branch I was willing to extend. I had put my own needs first, and I was learning, painfully and slowly, how to be steadfast in my own life. The message from Lily was the only crack in the wall I had built. For a week, I lived in my fortress of silence, and it was a strange, hollow kind of peace. But her words, they were different. They were innocent. The day after our text exchange, another message came from her. "Grandma, Dad is a wreck. He won't eat. He just sits there. He asked me to ask you if you would just talk to him. One last time, please." I read it and felt a familiar, painful tug. He was using her, of course, using his daughter's good heart as a key to a door he could no longer open. the old Eleanor would have crumbled. She would have seen her son's pain and rushed to fix it, no matter the cost to herself. But the old Eleanor was gone. Still, I considered it. Not for him, not for Brenda, for me. There were words lodged in my throat, truths that had been silenced for decades, and they were heavy. I realized that my house cleaning wasn't quite finished. There was one last room to clear out, one last piece of furniture to haul to the curb. I needed to say my piece, not to win an argument, but to hear the words in the air, to make them real, to close the book so I would never be tempted to reread it. I texted Lily back. "Tell your father I will meet him at Mr. Harrison's office tomorrow at 10 a.m. He can bring your mother." Setting the terms was important. It would not be in my home, my sanctuary. It would not be in their house, their crime scene. It would be on neutral ground, under the calm, watchful eye of the law. It was not a family reunion. It was a deposition. That morning, I dressed carefully, not in my Sunday best, but in a simple, comfortable dress. I made my tea, just as I always do, but I poured it into a thermos and took it with me. I wanted something of my own to hold on to. When I arrived at Mr. Harrison's office, he greeted me with a solemn nod. He showed me into the conference room. A long, polished table, a pitcher of water, a legal pad at his place. He was there not as a lawyer, but as a witness, a silent keeper of the peace. I sat down and poured my tea into a simple ceramic mug he had provided. I cradled it in my hands. The warmth seeped into my palms. It was a small, solid thing in a world that had felt like it was dissolving. I was calm. There was no anger left, only a vast, clear-eyed stillness. They arrived precisely at 10. When Mr. Harrison showed them in, I saw them properly for the first time since that day on the porch. Mark looked awful. He had lost weight. His eyes were red-rimmed and shadowed with a desperate, pleading look. He was a boy who had been caught and just wanted his mother to make it all okay. Brenda was another story. She walked in behind him like a general surveying a battlefield she had no intention of losing. Her face was a mask of defiant anger. She was not here to apologize, she was here to attack. They sat down opposite me. The vast, polished expanse of the table felt like a chasm between us. Mark spoke first, his voice hoarse. "Mom, thank you for coming. We've been so worried." I just looked at him. I didn't help him. I let him struggle. "Look," he stumbled on, "what you heard that day, it wasn't what it sounded like. It was a joke, Mom. A stupid, awful, terrible joke. Brenda was just stressed about money. She didn't mean it." He looked at Brenda, a desperate plea for backup. She just gave a tight, almost imperceptible nod, her arms crossed. I took a slow sip of my tea. The mug was steady in my hands. I placed it back on the table with a soft click. "It wasn't about the joke, Mark," I said. My voice was low and even, but it filled the quiet room. I've heard Brenda make jokes for 20 years. I know what they sound like. I paused, letting the words hang in the air. I looked directly at my son, into those tired, pleading eyes. "It was about your tired sigh," I continued. "It was about the sound you made right after she asked why I was still alive. It wasn't a sigh of disagreement. It wasn't a sigh of shock. It was a sigh of weary agreement. It was the sound of a man who sees his mother as a burden and is too tired to even pretend anymore. In that one sound, you said yes to everything. Yes, she's a problem. Yes, her death would be a solution. Yes, let's talk about how to spend her money and dispose of her things. Your silence was your signature, Mark. The sigh was the ink." He flinched as if I had struck him. The color drained from his face. For the first time, he had no answer. I had taken away his excuse, his flimsy shield of misunderstanding, and shown him the ugly truth of what he had done. He just stared at me, his mouth slightly open. That's when Brenda knew she had to intervene. Her chair scraped as she leaned forward, her voice a low hiss. "How dare you," she said. "How dare you sit here and twist things? We have given you everything. We gave you a place in our home, in our family. We have bent over backwards for you. And over one stupid comment, one little moment of stress, you decide to blow up this entire family? To punish your own son? To turn your granddaughter against us? This is the most selfish, manipulative thing I have ever seen." She sat back, breathing heavily, a look of triumph on her face. She had thrown her grenades of guilt and accusation. She expected me to defend myself, to argue, to get emotional. I didn't. I looked at her, and for the first time, I felt nothing. No anger, no resentment, just a kind of detached pity. "You still don't understand," I said calmly. "This isn't a trial. I'm not here to prove my case, and you're not here to defend yourselves. There is no family to blow up, Brenda. You two blew it up yourselves, quietly, over many years. I just finally heard the explosion. This meeting isn't a negotiation. It's a notification." I turned my gaze back to Mark. He looked broken. "I loved you," I said, and the past tense of the word was a final, tolling bell. I loved the boy I raised. I don't know the man you've become, the man who would sigh at the thought of his mother's death, and I don't have the time or the heart to get to know him. I stood up. My movements were slow and deliberate. I left the half-full teacup on the table. Mr. Harrison, who had been completely silent, also rose. "This conversation is over," I said. Not to them, but to the room. I looked at Mark one last time. "I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for, Mark. I truly do." And then I turned and walked out of the room, without a single backward glance. I heard Brenda start to say something, but the heavy door clicked shut behind me, cutting off the sound. As I walked out of the building and into the bright, indifferent sunshine, a feeling washed over me that I hadn't expected. It wasn't triumph. It was emptiness. A vast, clean, echoing emptiness, where a whole section of my life used to be. But it wasn't a painful void. It was a peaceful one. The heavy weight was gone from my chest. The unspoken words had been spoken. The final cord had been cut. I was alone, but I was free. And for the first time in a very long time, the future felt like it was entirely my own. Walking out of that office, leaving them behind the closed door, was like stepping out of a house I had been trapped in for years. The first breath of open air was sharp and cold, and it made me feel dizzy for a moment. But it was the air of freedom. The days that followed that final meeting were strange. The constant tension that had been a knot in my shoulders for as long as I could remember was gone. The phone was silent. The doorbell never rang. But the quiet in my apartment was no longer peaceful. It was haunted. Every object, every photograph on the wall seemed to whisper a story from a life that wasn't mine anymore. There was the armchair where Mark used to sit when he'd visit, the spot on the wall where I'd measured his height as a boy, the recipe box filled with cards in my mother's hand, recipes I had cooked for him 1,000 times. I realized I hadn't just cleaned house by cutting them out. I had emptied the house, and I was living in the echo. I had won my independence, but I was still living on the battlefield. About a month after that last meeting, I woke up one morning and the sun was pouring through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. I looked around at the familiar furniture, the familiar walls, and I knew this was not my home. This was a museum. a museum dedicated to the memory of a woman named Eleanor who had spent her entire life being a mother. That woman was gone. It was time for the new one to find a place of her own. The decision, once made, was simple. I called a real estate agent. I put my little apartment, the place I had lived for 30 years, up for sale. I didn't want a big house. I didn't need empty rooms to remind me of who wasn't there. I was looking for the opposite. I was looking for a space that was exactly the right size for one person to be happy in. Packing was a ritual of letting go. Box by box, I sorted through my life. It was both painful and liberating. I found his first baby shoes, and I cried as I wrapped them in tissue paper and placed them in a box for Lily. Maybe one day they would mean something to her. I found the silver-framed photograph from Mark and Brenda's wedding that used to sit on my mantelpiece. I looked at their smiling young faces for a long moment. Then I took the photo out, tore it into small pieces, and put the empty frame in a box for charity. I kept my books. I kept my mother's teacups. I kept my old, worn gardening gloves, even though I knew I wouldn't have a garden. I kept everything that was truly mine, that belonged to the Eleanor who existed before and after motherhood, and I let the rest go. I found a new place on the other side of the city. It was a small, one-bedroom apartment on the 7th floor of a modern building. It had no history, no ghosts. It was just clean lines and empty shelves. But it had one thing that sold me the moment I saw it: a small balcony that looked out over the city rooftops, big enough for a chair, a small table, and a few pots of herbs. A little piece of the sky that was all mine. The day I moved in, the place smelled of fresh paint and possibility. It was terrifying and wonderful. For the first 2 days, I just unpacked the essentials: my bed, my books, my kettle. I sat on a cardboard box in the middle of the empty living room, drinking tea and watching the light change as the sun moved across the sky. On the 3rd day, I knew what I had to do. Before I hung a single picture, before I arranged the furniture, I went to my kitchen boxes. I unpacked my flour, my sugar, my spices. I found my mother's old ceramic pie dish, the one with a small chip on the rim. I found my rolling pin. The wood was smooth and familiar in my hands, and I started to bake. I measured the flour. I cut in the cold butter, crumbling it with my fingertips until it felt like coarse sand. I rolled out the dough on the new, clean countertop. Every motion was a prayer, a meditation. I was reclaiming this simple act. The first pie had been an offering, a gift that was thrown back in my face. It was baked with the desperate hope of being loved. This pie was different. This one was a declaration. I was baking it for me, because I loved the smell of cherries and cinnamon, because the familiar weight of the dough in my hands grounded me. The scent of it baking filled my new, empty apartment, chasing away the sterile smell of paint and filling every corner with the warm, sweet scent of home. When it came out of the oven, golden and bubbling, I didn't cut into it. I let it cool on the counter, a quiet promise. I picked up my phone and sent a text to Lily. "I'm in my new place," I wrote, "and I have something for you." She came that afternoon. When I opened the door, she stood there with a small potted geranium in her hands. "For the balcony," she said, her smile so bright and real it made my heart ache, in a good way. There was no awkwardness between us. We didn't talk about her parents. We didn't talk about the past. I showed her my new, small home. She loved the view from the balcony. We sat at my little table, the one I'd bought just for that spot, and I cut 2 large slices of the cherry pie. I watched her take the first bite. Her eyes closed for a moment. "It's perfect, Grandma," she said, her voice a little muffled. just like I remember. And in that moment, I knew I was healed. The circle was complete. This pie wasn't left to grow cold on a lonely porch. This pie was being eaten. It was being enjoyed. It was a symbol of love that had been received. We sat there for hours, talking. She told me about school, about a boy she liked, about her dreams of becoming a vet. I listened, and I felt a sense of peace so profound it was almost overwhelming. Before she left, I took her into the kitchen. I handed her a pen and one of my recipe cards. "I want you to have this," I said. "The real one. It's not written down anywhere else." I stood beside her and dictated, step by step. "The secret," I told her, "is ice-cold butter. Your great-grandmother taught me that. She said it's what makes the crust flaky, so it shatters a little when you bite into it. A little bit of beautiful breaking." She wrote it all down in her neat, youthful script. She was receiving her true inheritance. Not a house, not money, not jewelry, but this. The warmth of a kitchen, the continuity of love passed down through generations, the knowledge of how to create something beautiful and nourishing with her own hands. After she left, I washed the 2 plates and the forks. I put the rest of the pie away. Then I took my cup of tea out onto my balcony. The sun was setting, painting the clouds in shades of pink and orange. The city lights were beginning to twinkle on, a whole universe of stories. I wasn't a part of their story anymore. I was a part of my own. I had found that a home wasn't made of walls, or a deed, or a certain address. A true home is a place where you are respected, a place where you are safe. And as I sat there, wrapped in a blanket, watching the night unfold, I realized that for the first time in my life, I was truly, completely, and peacefully home. It's been over a year since I moved into my little apartment in the sky. It's funny how time works. For so many years, my life was measured by holidays, birthdays, and school events all centered around my son's family. Now, it's measured by the changing of the seasons on my balcony, by the rhythm of the new herbs I plant in the spring, and the way the evening sun hits the wall in the autumn. It's a quieter clock, but it's mine. The silence in my home is no longer an absence of noise. It's a presence, the presence of peace. My days have taken on a gentle, predictable rhythm. I have my books, my walks in the park, my weekly calls with Lily from her university dorm. Her voice, bubbling with stories about her classes and new friends, is the sweetest music I know. We don't talk about her parents. There's no need. Our relationship exists in its own clean, sunlit space, completely separate from the shadows of the past. The past did try to knock one last time, though. About 6 months ago, a thick letter arrived in my mailbox. I recognized Mark's handwriting on the envelope immediately. A younger me would have felt a jolt of panic or a surge of hope, but all I felt was a quiet, distant curiosity. I took it inside, made my cup of tea, and sat out on my balcony, in my favorite chair. I opened it with no sense of urgency. It was long, 4 pages, front and back. He wrote about how his life had unraveled since that day. Brenda had left him. The big house by the lake, their fortress, had felt empty and cold, and he'd sold it at a loss. He wrote that he was in therapy. He wrote that he finally understood the depth of his cowardice, the poison of his silence. He used words like shame, remorse, and unforgivable. He didn't ask me to come back. He just asked for my forgiveness, so that he could maybe, one day, forgive himself. I read it all, from beginning to end, without shedding a tear. I saw the words, and I believed he was in pain. I believed he was sorry. but his sorrow felt like a story from a book I had read a long, long time ago. It was about characters I no longer knew. His apology was for him, not for me. My healing had not depended on his remorse, and my peace could not be enhanced by it. I was already whole. When I finished reading, I carefully folded the pages and put them back in the envelope. I went to the old wooden box where I keep important documents: my birth certificate, my marriage license, my late husband's death certificate. I placed the letter inside, alongside the other records of a life that was now part of history. I didn't rip it up. I didn't burn it. The past happened. It's not something you can erase, but you don't have to live there. You can file it away. And so I closed the lid on the box, put it back on the high shelf in my closet, and the matter was closed. I never replied. There was one last piece of business from my old life, however. The money from the sale of my apartment, the place I had lived in for so long, had been sitting in a savings account. It was my nest egg, the one I had so carefully guarded. But sitting there, it felt like another relic of the past. It was money I had saved for a future I no longer wanted or needed. I knew what I had to do. I called Mr. Harrison. We met one last time in his quiet, orderly office. He looked at me and smiled, a real, warm smile. "You look well, Eleanor," he said, and I knew it was true. "I want to set up an educational trust," I told him, "for Lily. I want every penny to go towards her university tuition, her books, her living expenses. I want her to be able to build her future without a single cent of debt." This time, when I picked up the heavy fountain pen to sign the documents, my hand was light. I wasn't giving something away out of a sense of duty. I wasn't reclaiming something out of a sense of anger. I was investing. I was investing in the future, in Lily. I was converting the last remnants of my old life into the foundation of her new one. It was the best, cleanest, most joyful act of my life. Lily got into her first choice university, the veterinary program she had dreamed of since she was a little girl. She is thriving. She is becoming a woman who is strong and kind and knows her own worth. That is my true legacy. She is my fortress. Sometimes, when I'm sitting out here on my balcony as the evening draws in, I think about that question I overheard through the window. That cold, cruel question that split my life in two. Why is she still alive? They thought they were asking about money, about a house, about an inconvenience, but they were asking the most important question in the universe, and I'm grateful for it, because it forced me to find the answer. I know the answer now. I am still alive to feel the warmth of the sun on my face, to read a good book to its final page, to hear the laughter of my granddaughter over the phone. I am still alive to have learned that you can survive the deepest betrayals and build a new home, not of wood and nails, but of dignity and peace. And I am still alive to teach my granddaughter the most valuable lesson of all, that the greatest inheritance you can give someone is not a house you built for them, but the example of how to build and protect a home inside themselves.